Angela. Welcome to our kind of conversational interview. Angela is an HR specialist, and I'm looking forward to having a chat about all things HR today. Good morning, Angela.
Good morning. Lovely to have the opportunity to talk to you.
Yeah, great. So I think let's start by maybe just giving a bit of background to you and why people should listen to you.
Okay, right. So my company is the HR consultancy. I set the business up nearly 9 years ago now, having had a career working in corporate HR for a range of different organisations at senior levels. Decided I wanted to set up, an independent business and work with smaller employers and see if I could make a difference. So yeah, nearly 9 years. It'll be 9 years in June. We're now a team of 6 of us. So the business has kind of gradually grown iteratively, which is great. Our kind of ethos really is very much about working with small businesses, helping them to do what they need to do, but in the way they want to do it. So we don't prescribe you must do. We tell them what they ought to do and help them do that in the way that best suits their culture and their values as a business. So there's this is the HR service we provide. We talk to people about what they need, and then we tailor what we deliver to meet their needs.
Brilliant. Good. So, I mean, I've got some questions. I've got questions that were sent in from our mastery group, and then I've put some of my own questions in as well. And I know you've been doing some fantastic work with quite a number of my clients already, which was what prompted me to actually get in touch with you in the first place. So let's start with what is legally required to have in place when you employ people. What are the absolute must-haves?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you decide to employ somebody, you must have a contract of employment, or as it's officially known as a statement of terms and conditions needs to be issued. So a contract can be verbal, as in any form of law, but you must issue a statement of terms and conditions, and there are certain things that have to be in that statement of terms and conditions, very explicitly put to the individual. And that now has to be issued on day one. You also need to check that people have the right to work in the UK, and you need to demonstrate that you have made those checks in case you're ever questioned on that. You also need things like a data protection policy, because obviously by employing somebody you're collecting some of their data, which obviously you need for legitimate purposes, so you need to make sure that that's very clear, and that's something that would go in the statement of particulars as well. So that's the absolute minimum that you need to have. So there's some thinking to do around that in terms of what are your terms and conditions going to be, and then there's formalizing that into a statement of terms and conditions.
And it sounds like it's been changed recently that it has to be on day one, because yes. I definitely know some clients that have brought people on and haven't quite got the contract ready yet, and it's taken a little while, and yeah,
absolutely. So that came in April 2020. I think it went under the radar a little bit because we were right in lockdown at that particular time. Up until that point, you used to have 2 months to do that, which was never ideal, because obviously people, if they're leaving a job to start a new one, or taking on a big commitment to be employed by someone, they want to know what their terms and conditions are. So I think it's right that it now is day one. I usually advise to issue it before day one, once all your clearances are checked. So if you're taking up references, or you need DBS checks or right to work checks done, and you've got the start date agreed, then that's a good time to issue it. So obviously the individual is very clear on what their terms and conditions are.
Okay, and then so that's a legal requirement. Are there any other kind of policies that are not legally required but that you would suggest should absolutely be in place?
Yeah, sure. I tend to suggest the first one would be a disciplinary procedure, to make sure that's in place. And the reason I suggest that is, if you haven't got a disciplinary procedure in place and somebody does something wrong, how do you tell them they've done something wrong? What standards are they working to? So I tend to advise contract of employment, disciplinary procedure. Usually the next thing I'd say is sickness absence policy, so people are clear on that. You can put some of these things in your statement of terms and conditions, but you don't want to put the whole policy process, etc. So getting that right from the start. And then I guess the third thing would be having a clear probation process, so a policy on that. And probation, what we'll talk about, I think, is a really important stage in terms of the employment. I guess those would be the main ones, I would say. Grievance perhaps next, and then another area would be induction, which is really, really important. Now, some of these things you don't necessarily need to formalise quite so much. Disciplinary procedure, absolutely. Sickness, you do. Probation, ideally. Grievance, ideally. Induction can be informal, but it needs to be thought about.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I've just seen too many instances where people are so desperate to fill a space where the clinics are running at full capacity, or they overrun, and they're desperate to get someone on board, and they bring someone on board and they chuck them in and they get on with it, and it isn't done formally, and then mistakes are made, or 3 months down the line they wonder why the person's not really getting on, and actually because they haven't actually inducted the person properly.
Absolutely right.
Yeah. And then what about self-employed team members? Are there policies and things that you need to have in place for them? Should you have them? Shouldn't you?
Right, now, yes, you should. You need to be very, very careful if you are taking on somebody on a self-employed basis. So careful with your language, that you don't talk about work, and you don't call them an employee. Team members, absolutely fine. But I would definitely advise you have a contract for services in place. And that's a written contract. So the individual is under, no misunderstanding that they are not an employee or a worker. They are a contractor, and that's the basis on which the contract is formed, that they will provide services, that you will not be responsible for their national insurance or anything else. You don't have to put them in the pension scheme, etc. I should have mentioned pension schemes, actually, because obviously that's another thing you have to have in place. You have to offer a pension scheme if you employ somebody. But obviously for somebody self-employed, no, you don't. But it's making sure they are very clear. What you don't want is a loose relationship with somebody who's self-employed. And I've got a company who's got somebody at the moment, used to be employed, retired, has come back doing some work with them. They're saying on an invoice basis, but he's suddenly saying, why don't I get holiday pay? I'd like some holiday pay. And you're like, well, no, you don't get holiday pay when you're a contractor. But there are lots of cases and lots of claims where people have been on that self-employed basis for a while, and then suddenly come back if they go off sick and they're saying, well, don't I get sick pay? Well, no, that's the basis of self-employed. So definitely have that contract in place and make it very clear to the individual that that is the basis you're working with them.
Yeah, and we've had loads of conversations around this, because I think a lot of clinics have a lot of self-employed people in that really should be employed because of the way they're treated. And so I guess, it's making sure that whatever you've got in your contract, you're actually implementing as well.
Absolutely right. Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
And it's all about, well, there are various different tests of whether somebody should be an employee or self-employed, of which one is how much control you've got of that person. So if you're somebody self-employed, you've got should have very limited control. And control covers things like expecting them to wear a uniform, expecting them to turn up at a certain time. Those kind of things you have to be very mindful of.
Yeah, good. So we touched on leave and sick leave now. What are the minimum requirements around leave, sick leave, and compassionate leave? Obviously, there's no requirement for self-employed, but if you have an employed person, what are our minimum requirements?
Okay, so the minimum requirement in terms of holiday, annual leave, is 28 days. So that's the 8 bank holidays, or this year there will be 9 as a one-off, and then 20 days leave that the individual can take. So in total, 28 days you're entitled to. Obviously, that's pro rata for part-time employees based on the number of days they do. In terms of sick pay, the minimum requirement is you pay statutory sick pay, and that's you have to administer that. For small businesses, back in the day, about 5 or 6 years ago, you used to be able to claim back statutory sick pay. That's no longer the case. You have to pay that as an employer. That kicks in from the 4th day of absence. So if people are having odd days, they're not entitled to statutory sick pay. It's only when they're off for a period of 4 days or more that they start being entitled to statutory sick pay, which you have to pay. In terms of other types of leave, clearly maternity, paternity, shared parental leave, those kind of things, there are statutory requirements around those. Bereavement leave, there is a new requirement. Again, this came in with the changes in April 2020. Parental bereavement leave, where there's an entitlement to 2 weeks paid leave, but it's a statutory rate, which is equivalent to maternity leave of £151 a week at the moment. So that's parental bereavement leave, where it's a child up to the age of 18 that's died, unfortunately. There is a sort of misunderstanding about compassionate and And bereavement leave, there's an automatic entitlement to that. There's only an entitlement to bereavement leave if it is a dependent. Often companies put policies in place for some of these things. There is an entitlement to emergency dependence leave, but again, there's no entitlement to pay for these things unless that's your policy. So emergency dependence leave is when a dependent, doesn't have to be a child, needs attention. So it could be, you know, nursery ringing saying your child's sick, but it doesn't mean you can have the whole week off. It's the emergency of having to collect that child, and then you're expected to make arrangements or take holiday entitlement, unpaid leave, whatever, to cover that. So those are the main entitlements. So leave's quite a complex area, and there are quite a few myths around that, you know, around that area as well, in terms of what people are entitled to or not entitled to.
Yeah. And what is the kind of best practice or most commonly offered? So I think probably mostly in sick leave. I've seen various different where, you know, companies will say that, you know, for the first however long you're on full pay, and then you'll go on to half pay. So, you know, in terms of, so I guess it molds into the next question of what do you need to do when an employee is absent due to illness indefinitely as well?
Yeah. I would say the most common for small businesses, for SMEs, is just to pay statutory sick pay. That would be the most common. Some bigger businesses, more established businesses, certainly the health service, public sector, are far more generous in relation to sick leave. And it's exactly as you said, after a year's service, you're entitled to perhaps a month's sick pay after 2 years service, that kind of thing. It goes up, and to as much, I think the maximum I've seen generally is sort of 6 months full and 6 months half pay for people who've got sort of 5 to 6 years service or more. But SMEs tend to just pay statutory sick pay in all sectors that I work with. It's a difficult one. It feels a bit mean in one sense, but if you think about a small business who, you know, can they afford to pay somebody for a sustained period of time, you know, when they're not working for them, when they've only got 3 or 4 people employed, very difficult to that.
I think that's one of the challenges that in our sector, where people are trying to get therapists that are maybe working at the NHS, and they've got really good pensions, and they've got really good sick leave options, and et cetera, et cetera. It's really difficult for them to compete with that.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's all down, I guess, to what people feel, what people value, and what people feel comfortable with. I mean, you know, in a way, I think it's quite worrying that people are concerned about the sick pay. Does that mean you think people need to use it, and therefore, you know, do I want to employ you on that basis if that's a concern? But if you're looking at leaving the NHS and you've got that backing behind you, then yes, I should imagine it is quite concerning for people to that leave around.
And so I've got a client, a particular client at the moment that we've kind of got through to the other end now, but there was this kind of employee that was absent due to illness, and there seemed to be no end to it. And what are the kind of things that you need to do to manage that?
Absolutely. So, you know, there isn't an entitlement to be off sick. Your contract is actually to be at work, and that's what you're contracted to do. Clearly, a valid reason for not being at work is that you are sick. But as an employer, you need to make sure people are genuinely sick and they're sending in the appropriate medical notes. And then you need to be proactive in terms of keeping in touch with that employee and talking to them about their likely return to work and their medical condition. If you get to the point where the individual's been off a month and it doesn't look as if they're likely to come back, then I tend to advise at that point you having the conversations with the individual, but you try to get a medical report. And you've got 2 choices there. You can either write to the individual's GP, or you can request, you know, that you refer them to an occupational health advisor, just to get an assessment of what the individual's illness is, how it might impact on work, when they're likely to return to work, how you can help them return to work in terms of making reasonable adjustments, that kind of thing. So you've got a view of that. Now, it may be at this point in time that the prognosis is the individual's unlikely to return within the foreseeable future. And if that's the case, on that medical evidence, you're perfectly within your rights to actually say to the individual, we're going to have to end your contract at this point in time. because clearly, you know, they're not capable of doing, of complying with their contract, doing the job you need them to do. So you're perfectly within your rights to terminate the contract at that point in time. But it's really important that when you're making that decision, you do have the medical evidence to support that. So what you don't want is the individual saying, well, I can come back to work on Thursday. You know, why are you doing that? That's unfair. To actually do. So you have to go through a proper process and get your medical evidence to do that. But you do need to, it's very difficult, you do need to keep in touch with people and manage that situation. You know, it's a joint thing, understanding and keeping them in touch so that they're thinking about coming back to work, because often people can go off sick and then they feel completely isolated and it becomes more and more difficult for them to come back to work.
Good, thank you. So in terms of employment contracts, what are the kind of main options available? Because it's, you know, there's not just one standard, here's your employment contract.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously you can employ people on a permanent basis, you know, whether it's full-time or part-time. You can employ people on a fixed term contract. So if you're not sure how much work you've got, but you know you've got a project on, or you know you need somebody covered who's on sick leave or on maternity, etc., then on a fixed term contract. And then within that, you can have people who are on fixed hours, whether part-time or full-time, or you could have people on a variable hours contract. Now that can either be it's 20 hours a week and we'll decide on a monthly or weekly basis what those 20 hours are, or it can be fully variable in you're on a contract. I'm not setting a minimum or maximum number of hours, you know, will vary each week depending on the needs of the business. So you can have people on variable hours contracts, but they are employees on that basis. And that's very similar then to the 0 hours contract, where you're not offering any number of hours at all. You'll call me in when you need me. But they are employees on that basis, or workers. So any of those employment type contracts, people would be entitled to sick pay, holiday pay, and any other benefits that other staff are entitled to. So there is quite a range of ways you can employ people without it being a permanent full-time arrangement that you've got within.
Yeah, because I think sometimes that's the often is the perceived barrier, that you're going to give this person a full-time job and you're going to have to pay them £3,000 a month, and you're kind of concerned about where that money's coming from. Which, I mean, in a way, you kind of look and think, well, so many other industries, that's how it works, and it does work. And in most instances, you bring a physio on board, you'll probably fill up their books quite quickly, especially at the moment. But I suppose just having those options is
absolutely important. You know, like any other contract that you might make, this is an agreement between the two parties. So, you know, it's very much discussing with the individual the basis on which you're engaging with them and issuing this contract, and ensuring there's comfort on both sides around that. But yet there certainly are, you know, options there. It's an interesting one, isn't it? I think you're absolutely right. You make that commitment and you're scared about making that commitment, but if you've got the hours available, you know, certainly that was the case in my business, then the business comes to you because you can take on that business, because you've got the resources to be able to do so.
Yeah, and I think in today's kind of market in our sector, giving someone certainty is really important, because I think those like kind of 0 hour contracts, you know, the person on the receiving end of that generally doesn't like it.
No, there's mixed press about 0 hours contracts. For some people it does work, but I think they're rare in terms of, but most people want that certainty and need that financial certainty of being paid, you know, each month or whatever that is.
Yeah, so it always reminds me of Dan Pink, who wrote a book called Drive, and he talks about, you know, people are motivated by money if there's a problem of money. And after, when you take the problem of money off the table, then there are other motivations that drive people. So, you know, that to me is always the kind of thing in my head is, what do we need to pay this person to take the problem of money off the table so that they'll get on and do the job? And then we need to work on motivating them in terms of mastery, autonomy, and purpose.
Absolutely right. And I absolutely agree with that. In terms of, you know, how much you pay people, it's not so much how much you pay, it's whether they feel it's a fair rate for the job. And obviously people have various benchmarks in which they make that judgment, but that's, you know, it's that felt fair factor around that.
And then what happens if you've got a contract in place and you want to change a clause in the contract?
Well, once the contract's in place, the contract is in place. So that's why you need to be very careful what you put in that contract. So if you want to change something, it has to be by agreement. Now, obviously, if you're giving me a pay increase, you are changing that contract. And I'm not going to say no around that. But if you want to change somebody's hours, if you want to change somebody's working arrangements, you know, all of these things have to be agreed with the individuals. So there are some things that individuals are quite happy to just to be aware of that are being changed, and that's not going to worry them at all. But, you know, things, fundamental terms, conditions like hours of work, amount of holiday entitlement, sick pay arrangements, that kind of thing, all have to be by agreement. So you need to consult with the individuals, and that consultation informs, you know, in explaining why, the rationale behind it, what it actually means for them, giving them the opportunity to raise any concerns. But hopefully you can come to agreement around that. If you can't come to agreement,
that was my next question.
yeah, absolutely, then it does become difficult. So you keep trying to get agreement, and often you talk about kind of paying sweeteners, you know, which might be giving a period of notice, or giving a bonus payment, or some other negotiation that will help the individual to, you know, to make that change that you need them to make. Ultimately, if that change has to be made, then you are ending the contract and starting a new contract. So one of the myths is that you just give notice. But actually, no, you can't give notice. You would have to end that contract and start a new one. Now, clearly, you have to give notice of the ending of the previous contract, and then you start the new one from the day after. Hopefully, you don't get into that situation, because that situation is where an individual potentially could take a claim against you for constructive dismissal, i.e. you're issuing them with a new contract that they can't possibly, you know, isn't fair, or they can't possibly fulfill, and therefore they've got no option but to leave, because you have actually dismissed them. So you could have a claim against you on that basis. But usually we find, even in big organizations where it's quite significant, you know, changes that are looked to be made, that it can be done by agreement, because individuals realize, well, the alternative is not to work here if I can't comply with that. But ultimately, any change in contract has to be agreed, because that's my contract, even if it's not written. And that's where you also need to be careful of custom and practice.
And something that just came up yesterday evening really was someone coming back from maternity leave, but wanting to change their hours, and so they don't want to come back in the same way that they left, and the business can't actually afford to have them only come back part-time. They need a full-time person. Where does a business stand with that? So
legally, the individual has the right to return to the role they left, so you have to provide that. They also legally have the right to ask for flexible working, for a change to that. So flexible working could be different hours, working from home, reduced hours, etc. Legally, the business has to consider that. You have to consider that, and you have to consider that formally, and then you have to have good reason for saying no. And, you know, obviously financial would be one, operational would be another, organizational issues would be another. So there are a set of reasons why you can turn that down, but you do have to consider that, and you have to be very clear that you have good reason for, otherwise you could have a claim against you if the individual cannot come back to work, or they can claim, you know, discrimination on maternity base. I mean, I would usually advise businesses to really look on the positive side of, you know, you've got an employee who they know, who they've had, you know, who's got experience, who understands their business. Why wouldn't you want to try to accommodate that individual? Now, I've got a company who had somebody who wanted to leave. They are a manufacturing company, and the shift started at 4:30, and this individual asked to leave at 3:30. Now, I think they've got a good reason for saying no there, because you're not going to be able to recruit somebody to do that extra hour. It's a line.
1 hour,
1 hour, they need the line. They've got somebody else who asked to work half days. Now, I think you can recruit somebody for the other half. So you haven't got a good reason there. So you've really got to think on a case-by-case basis.
Good, thank you.
Try to accommodate where you can.
So, okay, and so that leads me to another question about, what if you need to change someone's job description? So I'll give you an example where we've got, say, receptionists, where they've been they've been dealing with like a paper diary, and so they've been taking appointments in the paper diary. They've been, everything's been run on paper, and they've been doing all their filing, and that's kind of their job, is that they file the patient notes and they take appointments and they change appointments, but it's all done on paper. And then the practice puts in an electronic practice management system. All the therapists are doing all their notes online, so that part of the role's gone, and their role changes. How does one deal with that?
Right, absolutely. So you don't, first and foremost, you don't make the job description contractual. So you're very clear with your contract of employment that you have a job, and there is a job title, and duties can be changed from time to time, and you may be asked to do other things. It's good practice to have a job description, and obviously whether it's written or not, people have custom and practice what they do, what they see their job as. So in the scenario you're outlining, you would need to consult with the individual about the change, or the individuals about the change and how that impacts them. If you've still got work for them, that's one thing. You're consulting with them about their new duties and responsibilities and how you're retaining them on that basis. If you haven't got enough work for them because of that change, then potentially you've got a redundancy situation. So potentially you're in a situation, so in that scenario, it could be there's plenty of work for the receptionist to do, it's just different work. Or it could be in that scenario where there's no longer enough work for the number of receptionists you've got. So in that situation, you are into redundancy consultation, where you may have to let one or more person go, depending on the size of the organisation you're talking about.
The other situation that crops up here is the competency of being able to do the new role. So often the job changes so much, and the person that's in the position either just isn't able to fulfill that role because of their skill set, or rejects it and says, I remember I helped a client change over from paper system to electronic, and one of the receptionists was furious with me, and she was like kind of really, really cross and saying, I don't know why you're coming in here and changing things, and our system works perfectly. And luckily, when I saw this lady 2 months after the system was in, she was the most excited about it. So she did change around, but we could have been in a scenario where she was just like, I'm not doing it. I just don't know how to do it, and I'm not prepared to learn.
If that's the case, and the organisation is saying, but we believe you can and we want you to stay, then the individual's resigning there. Potentially they have the option to resign if they no longer want to do the job. If you have faith in the individual and the individual agrees and they start the new job and they're not performing in that role, then unfortunately you are in a situation where you have to look at performance management. So and that involves outlining to the individual where they're not meeting the standards you expect, and giving them time to improve, providing training and support to that individual to get them to where they need to be. So the onus is on both employer and employee to make it work there, but if it doesn't work, ultimately it's potentially dismissal.
But it's kind of going through that performance improvement plan scenario.
Completely.
Okay. Where do you find that you have most success with advertising? So both admin and clinical positions. We were speaking earlier about the how tricky it is to find people at the moment. So I just wondered if you had any kind of top tips about where to advertise.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's really difficult. It does depend on the role, and it depends on budget and what you want to spend there. So there's a whole range of different job boards out there at different prices. There are some very specialist job boards, and there are some that are very general. I mean, when people search for jobs, some of the search habit is just for an individual to type in, clerical assistant, admin assistant, physiotherapist. And if you've advertised on Indeed, that will come up because Indeed's got all the search engine, whatever it is, technical stuff behind it. So it's always good to put it on Indeed. Because everybody's heard of Indeed, they're constantly, advertising, etc. And if people just type into whatever search engine they've got, it will come up with wherever the job's advertised. But everybody advertises their job on that, so you're fighting with the thousands and thousands of other jobs. So Indeed do now have this option to sponsor. I would advise be very, very careful with what you're signing up for there, because that can end up costing you a lot of money, because you don't know how much you're going to pay. You can set a budget for the month, but you're kind of paying per click. So that's when somebody looks at it, not necessarily when they apply. So yes, that can be set, but be careful. So general job boards, depending on what role, certainly admin roles, that kind of thing, everybody knows to look in those places. And then, you know, for the more clinical roles, probably specialist roles, you know, NHS jobs, you know, that's where people who are in those kind of roles are looking, whether they're NHS or not, and you can advertise in those boards. And there are other specialist job boards as well to look at. Where do we have most success? It really depends. And often it depends on when we've advertised. It depends what day of the week you've advertised. And sometimes, you know, we can advertise a role, whatever that role is, and have very limited success, re-look at it, repost the ad a week later, and suddenly have a lot of applicants. So it's a really odd one. LinkedIn is expensive if you actually go down the placing an advertisement route. Placing it on your LinkedIn profile is a good way of encouraging people to apply. But obviously, you know, you're fishing worldwide, and as we've found with jobs recently, whatever those have been, we're getting people from around the world who need sponsorship, and sponsorship is a very big step, a very expensive step, and a very big step to go down. So certainly not to be entered into lightly, unless you do have, you know, a relatively senior role that's full-time, because the cost of it is pretty prohibitive in terms of that.
Yeah.
So it's difficult at the moment. So it's very odd.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you know, I think each sector is quite often insular, and they kind of think that it's only their sector that's struggling, and you know, it's like so difficult to get physios but actually I read an article in I think it was a Waitrose newspaper, and it was an interview of these head chefs, and they were talking about how they're really struggling to get front of house staff, and because the front of house staff role is not seen as a career, and they were talking about how they really want to change that actually, you know, you can come in, and it's not just for university students and, you know, a gap year job, and actually you can make a career of that. And they were just saying that that's the kind of change that they need in the sector to really change that around. And I think that kind of made me think about in our sector, in let's say physios, osteos, chiros, speech and language therapists, you know, when you look at the NHS, there's a career, there's a kind of career pathway in a way, that you go from, you know, grade 5, grade 6, grade 7, grade 8, and there's like this kind of laid out career path. And I think that that's maybe an area that needs to be developed in our sector, is that actually, you know, we're not just looking for a physio to do physio. Actually, and if you want to just do physio, that's fine. If you want to stay there and just be a physio, that's fantastic. But there are also other opportunities, and I think that that's maybe a gap that we could be really looking at in private healthcare.
I think
clinics.
that's a really good point. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It is all sectors. Before lockdown, I did a lot of work in this area with the county council, working with the hospitality sector, who exactly as you've described were really struggling to get people. And you know, other sectors as well. Now, this is where apprenticeships can be good as well, in terms of getting people earlier and making it a career path. So, you know, we could have a whole discussion on this one.
And I have got clients that take graduates on, and they have a graduate program that they go through, and you know, and I think that is definitely where we need to start. We just need to stop being more innovative in the sector.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, stop thinking you have to have the perfect person. Be open to taking somebody on at a more trainee level and training them and getting them integrated and involved in your business is one option.
Yeah, and as long as I've got the right attitude, you know, so I always say to my clients, you know, rather bring someone on board that is maybe lower skill level than you're looking for, but they've got the fantastic attitude and you can train them up, rather than having this highly skilled person that's got a stinking attitude.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah.
And so talking about how competitive it is, and the fact that recruitment is tough, what is your experience been in terms of remuneration models, and you know, are they that kind of, can we be a little bit more innovative on that? You know, what are the different options that we could be offering?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing people look at is the pay, most definitely still. Pay, location, and job title, probably in that order, is where people
Okay.
look. In terms of being innovative, I think what people seem at the moment to value, because I think of the lockdown experience, is flexibility, having that opportunity to work from home, having that opportunity to work more flexible hours. So I think there's an opportunity there to give people those opportunities that actually might fit better with your business than having to have the more structured approach around that.
Yeah.
In terms of other benefits, I think it links with that really. People do value holiday entitlement. So if you're offering over and above the holiday entitlement, I think what you said earlier about sort of, Daniel Pink's ethos, it is about, getting the salary right. I don't think people do particularly value bonuses and things like that are uncertain. They don't know whether they're going to get, but they might well value things like the organisation having an employee assistance program in place. They would certainly value, good training opportunities and CPD opportunities are things that people value.
Yeah. And then, so on that, what is a common practice in terms of paying for CPD and then contracting a person to stay within a certain period of time? So like, I know from kind of working in like straight after I did my law degree, that there were opportunities to, for instance, do your MBA, but then you'd have to work at the company for a certain period of time.
Absolutely. So usually this could be anything, and it does depend on the qualification. We had a company the other day who want to make them pay for every training course they do and stay for 4 years, and we're like, no, that's not reasonable. I think some training that you provide and pay for, you wouldn't want expect to tie the individual in, because it's training you need them to do to be able to do the job for you. But when it is a formal qualification and something that makes them more marketable, it is reasonable to tie them in for a period of up to 2 years after they've completed that qualification, and definitely to put that training and employment agreement in place so they know if they fail the course, don't turn up to the sessions, whatever, then they're liable to payment for that as well. You don't want to be stuck with having paid for something and then the individual fails it and they haven't got the qualification,
or drops out, or
drops out, absolutely, or leaves before they complete that. Then I tend to get the individual to pay back the full costs, would be my advice.
Okay.
And then on a sliding scale, once they've been with you, for a year after they've qualified, perhaps start reducing how much they have to pay back, because it's about you getting your value for money. I mean, if it's an MBA, something of that magnitude and that cost, then yeah, you do definitely want to tie them in for at least a good couple of years. If it's another qualification that perhaps costs £500-600, then perhaps tying them in for a year after they've completed it is reasonable as well. It's still a cost.
Okay. Yeah. And so, if moving tack a little bit, what is your recommendation in terms of one-to-ones and appraisals? And because I know, I've got kind of a scale of clinics where there's absolutely nothing in place, and then there's like, oh my gosh, just let me get on with my job in place. So what's the best kind of middle ground recommendation?
I think it does depend on the nature of the business, etc., and whether it is just a sort of touch base one-to-one, or whether you do need to give formal supervision because of the nature of the clients they're dealing with. I would think you need to have that one-to-one at least once a month, where you're actually taking time to sit down with your employee, have a cup of coffee, see how they're doing, on an informal basis, as well as making sure they are doing what they should be doing. If you've got performance indicators or targets, or they've been set objectives, at least once a month, or certainly once a month to do that. In terms of a sort of appraisal, I tend to go for sort of an annual review process where you sit down once a year and you look at what the business is trying to achieve, where that individual fits in with the business and how they're going to contribute, and set objectives, and then have a sort of 6-month review of where they've got to. But those one-to-ones are really important for kind of checking the individual is still clear on what they're supposed to be doing and they are getting on with it. Otherwise things get left. It's no good just setting objectives for a year and then only talking about them after 6 months. So annual review process where it's a sort of longer discussion that isn't just about the individual, it's about the business and where they fit in with the business and how they can contribute, because people like to feel part of wherever it is they're working. Yes, they like to get on with their job, but they like to sort of know the context in which they're working, that they are contributing as well. And then those regular one-to-ones every month to just touch base and check.
Yeah, I think one-to-ones once a month is really, really important. And unfortunately, what often happens is they're not scheduled in the diary, or or they are scheduled in the diary and then the clinic gets busy and they've got a long waiting list and I think, oh, we better just push that out and we put another patient in because that's more important for the business. But actually, if you don't look after your people,
absolutely,
you're going to end up, it's a kind of maybe a short-term gain putting that patient in, but it's a long-term problem.
I think so. And often it's the individual that cancels in because they recognise they're busy and want to do the job. So, as a manager, don't encourage that. Encourage them to have that time with you.
Exactly. And then, so what happens if things aren't working out with an employee? What process do you recommend on that?
Yeah, sure. So it depends really what isn't working out. If the individual if it's around their conduct, get my words out, it's around their conduct. So in terms of their behavior, if they're being rude to patients, that kind of thing, then that's a disciplinary matter to go through. If it's about their performance, so they're not meeting targets or the quality or the speed of what they're doing in terms of their work, or complaints about them, depending on what the complaint is, in terms of, if it's about their rudeness, then disciplinary. So the first thing is to decide whether it's a conduct issue where you do need to discipline somebody and say, this is not good enough. If this doesn't improve, we're going down the disciplinary route. That can be lateness, that could be sort of absence, etc. You're dealing with as a disciplinary matter. If it's around their performance, their quality of their work, you're just not comfortable about, then you've got the performance management process. Now that starts with those one-to-ones, with that regular supervision and actually making sure the individual is clear what you expect of them. It really starts with induction and probation right at the start. Making sure they understand the standards, what they should be doing, that they haven't forgotten something, that they know the processes, that they've had the right training, etc., that they're not out of their depth. So you start dealing with that as a day-to-day thing when you have those one-to-ones. Then you move to actually saying to the individual, we need to start talking about this now. You're still at the informal stage of the procedure, but we really need to talk about this. These are the standards that I expect of you. This is how you're performing, and this is the gap here. What can I do to help you? What issues are in the way of you performing? And you try to deal with it informally, but you warn the individual at that point in time, we will need to move to the formal process. You only move to the formal process when you can hand on heart say, I've tried to deal with this through day to day. The individual's fully aware. We now need to sit down formally, and at that point, it is a formal meeting you're arranging with them. You're giving them notice of that. You're giving the right to representation, and at the end of that meeting, you're making the decision whether to issue them with a formal warning. Once you've done that formal warning, you're then setting a time period for improvement, and if there is an improvement, you're moving on to a final warning, and then the same process. If there's not improvement, then you're looking at dismissal.
Okay. And then so if we go kind of back to the beginning of when someone starts with you, how should one manage the probation period? And then link to that, what if you go through, so let's say you give the person 3 months probation and you're still unsure at the end of the 3 months if they're the right fit, can you extend that probation? So how do we deal with probation, and can we extend it?
Absolutely. You should absolutely deal with probation. It should be in the contract that somebody serves probation. And you should have a clear process for that. Now, if it's a 3-month probation, that's quite a short period of time, particularly, if you start them in November and you've got Christmas in the middle of it, etc. So, there's nothing in law that says what the probation period should be, and it can be different from different people depending on the role. So determine the probation period and make that very clear to the individual, both in their contract and when they start, they are on probation. But you've got to follow up. So there's no good frightening the individual by saying you're on probation without doing anything. So you definitely need to have, if it's a 3-month probation, you need to be meeting with them at the 6-week point at the latest to check on them, check what support they need, check they've had all the training. If you've done induction well, then hopefully that's all ticked off and you've done what you need to at that point, but you might need to go over things. So at that point, you need to check how they're getting on. If you're concerned at that point, you need to start raising those concerns and put action in place on both parts. So have that midterm review, most definitely. If it's a 6-month probation, it can be difficult and you lose track. So I'd say when it's 6 months, you do want the 6-week review. You probably want the sort of 12-week review. And then just before the 6-month point, you have the final probation meeting. When you get to that final probation meeting, however long the probation period's been, you need to be absolutely comfortable that you can sign off that probation, that there are no lasting niggles, etc. So you're doing this very formally with the individual, and you're keeping a record of them, and it is very much both on your how you're feeling about the individual and how they feel they're performing as well. So you're getting their feedback. If you're under any doubt, yes, you can extend that probation. And once you extend it, though, you've got to keep on top of that, and you've got to make sure, if you're extending it for a month or 2 months, whatever you feel is appropriate, that you have that review meeting at the end of that point in time, and the individual knows where they stand. If you're extending probation, it is quite a big step, because it still gives that individual the uncertainty. So you've got to make sure you're clear on them. And often when people are uncertain, that can lead to their performance deteriorating or their motivation deteriorating. So be very clear why you're extending the probation, and then keep on top of that and make sure you meet with them again when you say, and decide whether to confirm probation at that point in time.
Okay. And then, so probably on that, but more kind of as a bigger picture thing, is that there are several software systems and things out there that help you manage that HR process. Yeah. Are there, what do you recommend? Do you recommend that people just keep written record of it, or are there actually systems that you'd recommend that people would use to make it easier and maybe more formal?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are a whole range of HR systems out there. And when I worked in bigger organizations, we'd spend hundreds of thousands of pounds on setting up those HR systems. We work with a company called Breathe HR, who a lot of people are aware of. They seem to have grown quite well. We've been working with them now for about 5 years. When I say work with them, we know their system inside out, and we recommend people because we know the system. They are very good value for money for what you actually get for your business. And most of the systems out there don't deal with small businesses. Breathe provides the system with all its functionality for companies who've got 1 or 2 employees. The prices have just gone up. It's about £130 a year now, so it's nothing in the context. I definitely recommend you have a system like that, because then you've got all your records in there. So all the personal data you're holding is all in one place. The individual has access to it themselves, and the individual can take responsibility for making sure it's up to date. Anything like the probation review meeting notes can be stored in there and open to the individual to see. So it's all open and transparent. It does have a built-in, they call it an appraisal system, where you set objectives, deliverables, etc. You can use that for managing one-to-ones and meetings with them. You've got your training records in there, you book holiday through that, you record sickness in that. So both sides can see. So it's not a hidden spreadsheet, and I'm recording your sickness here and you don't know about it, or I've got all these documents about you. It's all very, very open and transparent. So having that system that works for both the employee and the employer, I definitely say you want. There are plenty of other systems out there. As I say, we partnered up with Breathe, had lots of conversations with them, and found out about this system, so that we can comfortably work with our clients with that system. I don't know too much now about other systems, but I was certainly impressed that people were getting for £130 what I was paying hundreds of thousands of pounds to have that level of functionality in the past.
Yeah. And so last question from me is, how often should you review your HR policies and kind of HR systems in place?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you need to, review doesn't mean you have to change anything, but you should be very conscious of keeping things up to date. It's really, really important. One of the companies I know, I've started working with, they worked for another business, moved to this company, said, can you have a look at our handbook? It's from 2014. And we're like, oh my God, so much has changed since then. You lose track of time. So I would say you need to be aware of any changes that are going on and update things as soon as you're aware. But certainly on an annual basis, do that review of your handbooks, of your policies, of your contract templates, to make sure they are still up to date with current legislation. April tends to be the time when legislation changes, but not always. Not always. It can change at any time. We do employment law updates once a month to our to all of our clients, so they are aware of things. And obviously when there are big things happening, we recommend that do you want us to help and do a review to make sure everything's up to date.
Good. So how can my clients get in touch with you, and when they need you? I'm, as you know, as we spoke earlier, I'm a real advocate for for clients actually using HR specialists when it comes to getting contracts in place. It drives me up the wall when people ask for a copy of a contract from another company, because there could be some small nuance of difference that makes a huge big has an impact. And I have seen that happen, unfortunately, with clients as well. So I'm kind of a real advocate for just using, we're not, most of my clients are not HR specialists, so reach out to someone that can actually help them. So how can they get in touch? Do you have a newsletter that they can subscribe to, or do you have any social medias that they can follow you on? Just tell me how they can get in touch with you.
So yeah, we've got a Facebook page, we've got LinkedIn company page, we've got Twitter, on the website. Yes, you can subscribe to our newsletter, or just get in touch with us by email. As I said, earlier, what we like to do is to talk to people and find out what it is that, where they're at, what it is they want, and we will tailor the service for them. So we've got clients who we have a very loose relationship with. We perhaps don't speak to for 6 months, and then they've got an issue, somebody's gone off sick or there's disciplinary, and they come to us. We've got clients who we speak to most weeks because they kind of, they've got 20 or 30 staff and we are their HR department. But that's not what everybody needs. For other clients, we've set them up with all the processes and procedures so they can do all of those things themselves. And I'm happy to work whichever way suits the business. It's about making sure that they're not just getting templates, that they've got somebody they understand what they're issuing to staff, and that they're able to, have that backup and support in whatever form they need to make sure they get things right. And there's somebody there they can go to that they know and they trust if they do have an issue. I think people with HR, particularly with HR, people are kind of thinking, if I talk to somebody in HR, then they're going to tell me things I don't want to hear. It's like opening Pandora's box, and I'll have to do this and I'll have to do that. And they've kind of been oblivious to it for a long time, and it's not caused them any problems. And suddenly we're saying, oh, you do need contracts in place. It's like a bit sort of a scary thing, but we try to be, to give value for money to people, so that we want them to come back and talk to us about things, not think, oh, they're going to charge me, it's going to cost me loads of money. We'd rather talk to us when something happens, and it'll be cheaper in the long run, because we'll get you out of that situation. We'll find a solution for you one way or another.
Yeah. Angela, thank you so much for joining me. I think there has been a wealth of information in our conversation today, which I'm sure everybody listening is going to really, really value. So thank you very, very much for joining me. And, I know that you're doing fantastic work with quite a number of my clients at the moment. So, I'll keep recommending you.
Excellent. No, thank you very much. That's great. It's been lovely talking to you. A crash course in HR, I think, there.
Yeah, HR 101.
Absolutely. Yeah, lovely to talk to you. Talk to you again soon. Thanks.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Angela.
Bye.